Welcome back to another episode of Profitless on Purpose, the nonprofit accounting podcast. And I'm one of your hosts, AJ Wheeler. With me, as always, is Mark Palardy.
Hey, everyone.
Got a great episode this week. Have a article to talk about innovations and talent investment for individuals, organizations, and communities. What does it look like when your organization is reinvesting in their employees and leveling up their skills? What continuing education looks like, and what the findings are in this article for that type of engagement in nonprofits versus for-profits. We'll talk about all that and our experiences with continuing education in the nonprofit sector. And then our second article is using smart tech to reimagine nonprofit work. Can a chatbot help you not field dumb calls? Maybe. We'll talk about it and kind of our objections to the article and what we think about smart tech in the way that the article's talking about it. And then our third article is your monthly board meeting is a waste of time. We'll talk about how frequent maybe you should have nonprofit board meetings, why maybe a nonprofit board meeting every month is not the best idea, what some alternatives are, and why. We'll talk about all that this week. And then our topic for the week, or our question of the week, is religious exemptions from regular work duties. As an HR professional, what should you do if you have somebody that raises a moral or ethical objection due to their closely held beliefs in something that's a job duty of theirs? What can you do? What's the law behind it? We'll talk about all that this week. But Mark, you have our first article. Why don't you take it away?
You bet, AJ. This one is an article that's in the continuing series that we've really enjoyed, the 11 Trends in Philanthropy in 2022 from the Johnson Center. And this one is called Innovations in Talent Investment for Individuals, Organizations, and Communities. And what this article is bringing to light, which I hadn't really considered, was that in the nonprofit sphere, especially related to foundations, they invest about $29 per person for leadership development, for people to improve in their job skills. Whereas in a for-profit sphere, companies are spending about $120 a person. So if you look at that 30 versus 120, you can see that nonprofits are kind of spending about 25%. Granted, this is based on foundations, but nonprofits in general, who tend to run leaner, who tend to have lower rates of pay, are not investing in their leadership. And so there were some studies that were done, some surveys that went out. 10% of nonprofit CEO executive directors are from are people of color or from Black, Indigenous, or other communities such as those. And then basically these fellowship programs aren't helping to bring in new blood. They're focusing on, mid-career professionals, and they're not necessarily helping to bring in a more diverse group at the bottom and train them up and get them more invested in the ecosystem of nonprofits. So what does this mean? That's still up for debate, but they're just kind of pointing out that the for-profit sector seems to be more invested in bringing people up from the bottom, training people to eventually become, have that inline in their organizations to train people up, to educate them, to get them into the upper ranks. And nonprofits need to kind of get on board, especially now. I think with the job market being the way it is as we're recording this, obviously job markets fluctuate, but nonprofits already are a little behind the eight ball when it comes to hiring. So having not a lot of incentive for growth and promotion within is problematic. One of the solutions that they came up with, or one of the trends that they're seeing, which I think is also interesting and probably worthy of a different article or a different topic, is that many nonprofits and foundations are now adopting co-leadership or distributed leadership models, which this I find really interesting, because rather than have one executive director who is the end all be all, they're sharing that information, or they're splitting those job tasks either between two people, or they might have a panel of people who are acting as the executive director, which allows for more diversity, allows for more different ways of thinking about things. And it's a model that's fairly new, but seems to be a trend that is working for some nonprofits. So I'm curious, AJ, what you think of this.
Yeah, actually, I have a lot to say. I was on a board of a local like museum. Um, Man, they went through a really rough patch of like they had something like 3 or 4 different executive directors in the 3 years that I was with them, and every time an executive director would go, the board would have to scramble together and start doing a hiring process for these people. And they always wanted somebody that was, like in the museum space, in the, with years of experience. And what ended up happening at the end was I suggested that they take the staff that was there that was already kind of in a leadership position and split it. And they were kind of co-directors. And what that provided was insight from both sides. One was male, one was female. I think one was a BIPOC and the other was a white guy, but they were both very, they both had different ideas of where the museum could go. And my suggestion was that they co-lead. And it's actually, they've, stayed the course. I've kind of kept in contact with them and they are doing much better than they have before with this kind of trade-off of leadership or co leadership. And I think more people could learn from it. I think more organizations might benefit from something like that. What it does is, especially if you have somebody that at an executive level that's maybe getting older and is, close to retirement, this is a good way to, like succession plan. The other thing is you can really hone in and focus if you have somebody else to split the workload with. We all know how overworked most nonprofit staff are and how there's never enough hours in the day to accomplish everything you want to do. If you have like somebody that's co-leading the organization, you can kind of carve out, okay, I'll focus on programmatic things and the other executive will focus on, say, fundraising if they're, and kind of put people in where they're good at. The other thing that really struck me about this article was the continuing education and kind of the professional development that goes on in a nonprofit. And I was surprised to see that nonprofits lag behind for-profits, because it's been my experience the most successful nonprofits I've worked with, all, especially for program staff, they write into their grants continuing education dollars to continue to have their staff up to date on the most recent developments in that sector. Something like the mental health sector or, serving people with disabilities, there's always new literature and new things to learn. And I think having those professional hours behind you, heck, some of it's required for some of these certificates for if you're in a clinical setting, that's required. But as well as the real hard part of that, I guess, is providing continuing education to the executive or administrative staff, because those are usually not wrote into grants that cover, continuing education for your accounting staff, for your development staff, for your executives. And I think it's important for, just like it's important for program staff to have that kind of continuing education. Things change. I mean, heck, in accounting, like I can think of the last like 4 years, if your accountant didn't have up-to-date continuing education on, the FASB changes, the changes in how leases are going to be handled, the changes in, revenue recognition, there's been a lot of changing landscape as far as how revenues and just basic transactions happen in the accounting system. And I can't imagine if you didn't have the funding or the support for continuing education in that position, you would really be behind the eight ball and could lead to, audit findings, like being behind the times on how you're recording things and how you're thinking about things. I mean, heck, that revenue recognition for contracts for nonprofits, I mean, makes my eyes spin. And I'm an accountant that's, studied that stuff. You go through a 15-part flow chart to figure out how the hell you record a contract or how you're supposed to treat it. It can be daunting. And I think, continuing education is something that I believe, if you invest in your people, the return is tenfold in the organization. So I'm glad to see it be on the table. I think, we've talked about before on this podcast how I think more leadership and executive funding and non-restricted funding can really help a nonprofit. And this is one area I think, you can see where unrestricted funding that can be used for continuing education would be great.
Yeah, AJ, and I totally agree with everything you're saying. And I think the other piece to this, right, is that employees that often work for nonprofits are coming in at a lower rate of pay, but often because they believe in the mission of the organization. And if that's only gonna get you so far, right? If you're not offering chances for improvement and chances to kind of move yourself up and promote in the company, you might have some people who are happy to stay in one position for their whole lives, but you're going to have some who are going to say, well, I'm ready to move on. I'm ready to grow. I'm ready to go into something else. And a nonprofit, if you've already got somebody on the hook who believes in the mission, boy, that's gold, right? So retain that talent and invest in them accordingly.
Not only that, Mark, but I'm active on the nonprofit Reddit, and often I see, often when we talk about like wanting to hire an experienced hire in a nonprofit, that's great, but there seems to be a lot of want for people to cross over to the nonprofit sector, and I see a lot of questions regarding what they can do and how they can break in. And so I was confused because I thought it would be very easy for somebody to try and break into the nonprofit sector because of the shortages in staffing that you're seeing across the board. But I think, there's a mindset, I think that, if you're going to hire somebody in development, they have to have a development background that, bolsters them. The same thing with accounting, right? And I think there needs to be a way that you can bring in new talent like this that maybe doesn't have the experience behind them, but, can bolster it. And you're really going to provide goodwill with that employee and have them on, just like you talked about, somebody that's, dedicated to it and appreciative that they learned something and came in and was able to level up their skills. So,
yeah, the other thing I wanted to mention that you talked about is this distributed leadership piece. We have to really be careful that companies aren't virtue signaling, right? And I'll turn to a for-profit example that's happened recently here in the news. Blizzard Entertainment, right? They hired 2 CEOs. They were going through a sexual harassment, still are going through a sexual harassment scandal at their organization. And so they hired 2 CEOs to kind of have this look that they're really paying attention. One female who had been at the company a very long time, had a lot of experience, and one male who also had been at the company a while and didn't have as much experience as the female one. Well, after 6 or 8 weeks, she quit because they were effectively making him the boss and she was just there as window dressing, and it was just virtue signaling, look, we have a woman CEO, but they weren't giving her any of the power. So, with diversity hires, with making sure that you're covering your bases, you also have to make sure that you're treating people equally and that you're giving people a say in what's going on and that it's not just window dressing. So, AJ, on that note, let's get to our second article. We're never going to get through this podcast.
I know. We just had so much to say about this. It's because it was a very good article and very good points, Mark. So the next one comes from our way from Candid, and it's called Using Smart Tech to Reimagine Nonprofit Work. So when I first saw the headline of this article, I was thinking it was, oh my gosh, here's another one about, using automating your accounting system, or insert eye roll here for, whatever tech piece they were pushing. But actually, as I read it, I thought it was very interesting on how they were kind of deploying what they're talking about smart tech. And I'll tell you the angle that the article is coming from. This is specifically designed to reduce the amount of, I guess, busy work that nonprofits often find themselves doing. So the one example they give is somebody that is getting inundated with emails and calls regarding if their donation is tax deductible or something like that. So they make some suggestions here on 3 ways that smart tech can be used to shift your organizational work culture. And so they mentioned the example I just gave is their answer to that is invest in online chatbots. So what that is it's an embedded kind of chatbot. I'm sure you've seen it if you land on a sales page and there's a little blue word thing that comes up and, hi, I'm insert generic name what can I help you with? What this can do for a nonprofit is give simple answers to simple questions that usually take, staff answering the phone or an email that can, wreck a workflow. So it's like, are you open on Monday nights? Is my donation tax deductible? Where are you located? A chatbot that would, essentially spit out a automated answer to these kind of questions that's embedded in your website or on the phone. If they call in, they get a phone tree kind of, do you want to know our hours? Do you want to know the tax deductibility? So these can be really helpful. The other one is talking about improving workflow, and the implementation of like a intelligent virtual assistant, HubSpot and a couple other these things. Like I'm sure you've seen it at the bottom of an email where you can click and schedule a meeting with somebody, and it checks their calendar and what's available as far as time and dates go. So this can be, instead of having to connect with somebody and email back and forth and figure out a time that works best for you two, you can have one of these integrated smart tech things that, look into what your calendar availability is, what the other person's, and they're signing on to have a meeting with you so they can check their own availability and find something that jives with both. And then the other part is focusing on physical health. So this is deploying some kind of smart tech that allows people to get away from their screen, especially now that we're working remotely, or turning the corner to a lot of remote work. People can feel always on, and so they talk about health indicators, being able to limit the time that you're on the computer, or prompting you to get away from the computer for not just mental health but physical health. And then something I do is I kind of regulate when my instant messenger can ping me, and when I'm shown as available for those, and I set it up for a set time so that I'm not receiving messages. You can message me after hours, but I won't see it or get notified of it until the next day. And what that does is it creates so I'm not, thinking about something or seeing something come in late at night and working past hours, or working more than what I should be, and stepping away from that and giving my brain a time to kind of detoxify, or think a little bit. So I think these are all great kind of advice, and it was things that I hadn't thought about for the deployment of smart tech. Mark, I'm wondering, did you get anything else out of the article, or is maybe there's something that was missing from their list of the ways it can be implemented?
Yeah, I'm going to be a little contrarian here. Shocker. So I think the notion of employee burnout and wanting to take steps against that is great. Here are my two main problems with this article. Number one, okay, we develop all these systems to help alleviate employee burnout. We invest in chatbots and all these other things to help create a smoother way for employees to work. But if you are taking the tasks away from the employees, a nonprofit is going to fill those hours up with something else. It's not as though the burnout is going to go away. They're going to probably eventually see, oh, we're more efficient and we don't need to have as many people here on staff. So let's just hire less people, and then we'll make do with fewer people. And, burnout persists in any case. It's not as though this utopian, smart tech is going to then make everybody's life automated, and these pictures from the 50s of what the future looks like, with Rosie the robot. Yeah, it doesn't quite work that way. Second, even more bigger problem, at least as of right now, chatbots. I hate them. I hate them with a passion because they don't work well. And that, I know that's a tech issue, but let's just use QuickBooks, for example. Every time you try to get help and you want a specific question, okay, let's use our chatbot feature. Before you're able to talk to somebody, you have to go through like 20 screens of saying, no, that's not my problem. No, other, so that you get to a place where, okay, now we'll connect you. By the time I'm actually connected to a real person, I'm frustrated, and I'm more frustrated than I was just from my original problem. I'm frustrated that I had to weed through this kind of thing. I mean, airlines are notorious for this. Credit card companies, if you try to call them, you have to wade through all this crap before you actually get to speak to a person or deal with a problem. And I mean, perhaps for myself, I'm somebody who will always try to solve a problem first anyway. So if you make a knowledge base or something where I can search it and try to find my problem, that's great. Or, the great Google is often a great knowledge base of people who've had a similar problem to you. But if by the time I'm trying to reach out to an organization, especially a nonprofit, where maybe I'm wanting to figure out how to do a donation, if you're giving me a chatbot, I'm out. So sorry, that's a little heated, but I'm so over chatbots.
No, I think you bring up a good point, though, Mark. I think implementing this the correct way, right, and understanding that frustration. I think that's part of maybe what wasn't mentioned in the article that would be my critique is how to implement these correctly. You know what I mean? I think all these, it's like anything, right? None of it's a silver bullet. You're not going to, if you just take these 3 suggestions that they have in this article, it's not like you're going to relieve your nonprofit staff of mundane tasks and free them up to be, running through fields of daisies and, looking at clouds all day and, have all their work done as well. I think what you're really trying to do is, if implemented correctly, and I think the correctly part is the one that we want to stress here, that these can be good tools, but they're just that, they're a tool, and it has to be used the correct way. So, I mean, I think I hear you loud and clear about chatbots. I'm not a big fan of them either, although they are better than nothing, and you can usually get to somebody in a chatbot eventually, hopefully, and reach a real person that can type and answer your questions. But, I think it's better than the alternative of just somebody being left to their own devices to call, if it's one of those mundane questions, right? If the chatbot is very, the gatekeeper of dumb questions, then I think it serves its purpose, but you shouldn't rely on a chatbot to be the, bearer of news of your organization or the one place that somebody lands and they find themselves in if they have questions. I think having a line to a real person and being able to reach the nonprofit correctly is paramount in that situation. And it goes to show for the rest of them. I mean, we talk, do you really want your nonprofit knowing, or do you really want your employer knowing every time you step away from your computer, or what you're working on 24/7, and then them wrangling the hours away from you to be able to, well, you didn't take your break, you need to take a break. Well, I'm in the middle of something, that break can happen later. Just remind me. So, or the other part of, they're so worried about your health and well-being that it somehow affects your insurance premiums or something like that. This data tracking that's going on. So I think, smart implementation and using the tool correctly, I think is the way to go. So Mark, you have our next article for us. Hopefully it's a little more rousing than just, chatbots.
AJ, if you want me to read the next article, press 1 now. Anyway, our next
Need
article.
a beep.
Sorry, that option is not available. Sorry. Okay, so our next article is "Your monthly board meeting is a waste of time. Here's why." Okay, I love this article. This is coming at me right in the from somebody who has to attend monthly board meetings. I feel this. So essentially, the author of this, Joan Gary is her name, is laying out why the monthly board meeting might not be your best option. And effectively, the way she lays it out is that if you have a board meeting every month, let's say in mid-month, you start thinking about the agenda for the next month's board meeting. So then by late in that month, your board reports are done, your presentations are ready, and you've sent your materials out. So then let's say you have your board meeting on the first of the month. Great, board meeting happens. You arrive, you present your stuff. Then after that, in the early part of the month after the board meeting, you then have follow-up questions, other things you need to deal with as a result of the board meeting. And then mid-month, it starts all over again. And what the author says is that this doesn't give time for the information to breathe, basically, right? If you have committees that you want to have meet, they're not going to necessarily have time within a 1 month span to meet, get answers they need. They spend the executive director will spend more time over the course of a year doing follow-ups, wrangling information, helping finance to generate financials. And then these board meetings have such a predictable pattern. It's just like people are just there as automatons, showing up, punching in, doing the work, starting over, but it doesn't seem to generate strategic or generative thinking, right? And so you're not actually moving the ball forward, and you can get stuck in the weeds of the operations, right? Because, okay, what's happened since last month? And then you start talking about all the little things that have happened that really should just be, especially if you have a large board, a large organization, that should be the ED and down dealing with staff issues. The board really should be there for strategic planning and larger thinking. And sometimes when you meet monthly, that's not happening. So the suggestion here is for larger organizations, they benefit from longer quarterly meetings so they can actually take time to breathe, discuss situations, have input from committees. And then smaller organizations are people who are just starting out that actually need the board to do more of the hands-on work, right? If the nonprofit is new, it might make sense to have more regular, smaller monthly meetings because you're actually doing the work of the organization along with trying to determine the strategic planning. But, I have not heard this case laid out before, but in hindsight, it's like, that's brilliant. I mean, because I have been in large organizations where you're constantly either preparing for or following up from monthly board meetings, and then you have to have the extra meetings every year to talk strategic planning or the future, because you can't get it done in a board meeting. And I think, if you have let's say you have usually a 90-minute board meeting every month, if you stretch that out to like a 3-hour board meeting once a quarter, you're saving people time overall, but you actually get deeper into discussion. AJ, thoughts?
Yeah, I was going into this kind of with a contrarian view, but she won me over. Joan's suggestions here and her reasonable thinking, I think, and I have seen it work. I work for an organization currently that went from monthly board meetings to every other month, and I think it's a lot. There's a lot more, I guess, work that's done in between board meetings, where often you were finding, or the board meetings that I was sitting in on, there was like, it was the same thing. Oh, we're working on it. And finally, I think, after 3 or 4 board meetings of asking where projects were, they're, oh, okay, we finished this, or we have an idea, or here's the agenda or whatnot. The other thing I would say is, from a financial reporting standpoint to the board, especially for an organization, there's just not a lot. I guess there's not a lot of change to report on month to month. But if you have a bi-month, every other month board meeting, or even every quarter, man, there's been some significant, milestones that have been met during the year that you can real meaty discussions about what have happened, what's like not happened, and why. Whereas I think when you're going month to month, it's very mundane, and there's not a lot of meat on that bone because you're talking about it constantly. The other thing it can do is, if you're in a monthly board meeting with financial kind of results of operation, people can get really weighed down in the details. And, we've talked about before on this podcast about giving really distinct and abridged board financials to be able to, so that you're not getting a 30-minute conversation about why $20 is in miscellaneous expense, or why insurance is $5,000 this month. Well, hello, we just paid the quarter's insurance and you didn't see any insurance. Those are questions, I think, that can really distract from the overall mission and the organizational financial health. And it's something that I think the board is there for financial oversight. And of course, it should be their privy to have their questions answered. But I think when you're discussing why there was a $5,000 insurance expense this month and there wasn't the last 2 months, you get bogged down into very transactional detail that doesn't lead to great discussion outcomes, or even an understanding by the board of the financial health of the organization. So I think, depending on where your organization might have a different answer for a very small, and she does too, for a very small upstart nonprofit where the board needs to be more involved in kind of the day-to-day operations and monitoring cash flow and stuff like that, if you don't have a large staff or many staff at all. So I think my answer would change if you're talking about a very small or upstart nonprofit. But the ones that she's talking about in an established board, I absolutely see where she's coming from. And I think it's a great advice. I think it's great advice. And you probably can get more done with less, just like Mark said. But yeah, so I am all for, this kind of thinking of making it longer and more beneficial to everybody.
And if nothing else, have the conversation with your board, right? Bring it up at the next board meeting and say, So, I heard this fantastic podcast called Profitless on Purpose, and they were talking about having board meetings not quite as regularly as we do. Is there a reason we need to continue having these monthly, or would we benefit from having them, spread out? And just have the discussion. There might be very legitimate reasons to continue to have them monthly, or there might be reasons to just do, a physical or Zoom meeting every other month, and then just do a email check-in in between, something like that, where you can hybridize this. You don't have to make up the rules as they see fit for you. But, just opening the conversation, I think is just don't do it the way it's always been, just because that's the way it's always been. That's all I'm saying. So AJ, topic of the week.
Yeah, so this was an interesting one that you and I talked about, Mark, and it's religious exemptions from regular work duties. This is one that I was not, kind of privy to, and I've never been involved in on a religious exemption and what it means. So Mark and I we'll lay the case out here. So the question, or where we found this, was there's an HR manager that has they hired their food distribution, like think Meals on Wheels or something like that organization, and they have an employee that was hired on to do these food deliveries, and they objected for a religious reason that delivering the food would be, against their religious views, and that they held, but this is part of their job function. So they kind of and this kind of falls back to in the time of COVID, that there's vaccination policies, that religious belief exemptions that have been floated out there, and outside the vaccine context, how do you handle and accommodate a request when you haven't seen one? And this is something that I haven't come across. So that's kind of the question: how do you handle a religious exemption from regular work duties? And I thought the answer was kind of interesting. But Mark, you probably read up a little bit more on this than I have, so I'll let you take first swing at this.
Yeah, and I have to take off my HR hat. Not that I'm in HR, but who has a religious exemption against helping other people with food distribution? That seems really weird to me. But I don't know. Maybe they're a Church of Satanism or something, where they just agree with helping other people.
I was thinking about the same thing when I read this. But what about, like, I don't know, say somebody that's of the Muslim faith, that they're delivering pork, or like a vegetarian,
right? Yeah, and this article does get into that later, but just the blanket, we don't want to help people, just struck me as a little bit odd. But whatever. People can have these firmly held beliefs, whatever they may be, even if it's to not help other people. And the employer should be able to accommodate that if there is no undue hardship in doing so. So these accommodations are a normal part of, the workplace now, and workplace rights. So, and any discrimination on the basis of religion is unlawful. So as long as you're trying to accommodate the employee and they have a sincerely held religious belief, or, and religious is used by the EEOC pretty loosely, this is what I thought was interesting as we were kind of delving into the history of this, because the EEOC now considers a religious belief just something that is deeply held, even if it's not part of a quote unquote religion. So they've held that vegetarianism, Wicca, other non-traditional belief systems could fit the mold here. I, for example, am a vegetarian, and if somebody asked me to deliver pork, as AJ said, probably wouldn't be the thing I'd want to do. But if I can, if I have this deeply held belief and there is an accommodation that can be made, then great. If the thing that struck me a little odd in this particular format was that the article specifically, or the questioner specifically, lays out that this was part of the original job description. So if let's say I, as a vegetarian, apply to work at a meat plant, And then I say, it's my deeply held belief that I don't have anything to do with meat. How do you accommodate for that, right? And so if part of the job task is this delivery of food, and you knew that going in, is it the job, is it the responsibility of the organization, right? If this is an organization that once a year does food delivery as part of a volunteer service thing, absolutely accommodate. But if it's part of the job description and you knew going in, that's where I have a little bit of a, is it an essential part of the job? Is, I know we're kind of getting into the weeds, but it's tricky. And that's why I'm not in HR, right? But AJ, I'm going to stop right.
No, I think you bring up the biggest point that I had with the article, and they're bringing up Title 8 or whatever it is, Title 7. As essentially I can read like the law stuff here. Religious beliefs include theistic beliefs as well as non-theistic, moral, ethical beliefs to what is right and wrong and which are sincerely held. So the answer to the question is to sit down with the person that has these religious and find out if they're deeply, because I guess the crux of this is their deeply held beliefs. I could have an aversion to work and say it's, against my religious belief and try to just get paid for doing nothing, but I guess it's such a gray area, right? Like, how do you, as an HR, I guess if I was in the HR position, I would want to try and document this process, right? Because at the end of the day, what we're talking about is trying not to get sued for, letting somebody go or telling them you can't accommodate a religious belief. So I think documentation would be the correct thing, and that you went through this and hey, this was part of the job description. What part did you think you would be delivering food? Like in Mark's example of being a vegetarian and having to deliver animal products to somebody, could you just be signed up for all the vegan and vegetarian meals that you're delivering? What's an appropriate accommodation for somebody that holds one of these, closely held beliefs? And then what's the onus on the person accepting the job of reading the job description and understanding it? And like Mark said, if this is a once in a year kind of thing, sure, you can, I'm sure if Mark worked for an organization that handed out meals or, free turkeys on Thanksgiving or something to underprivileged people, might say, I'll hand out some tofurkeys, but not turkeys, so is there a workaround here? You know what I mean? And is there something that can be where somebody isn't, subsiding or, passing away their personal views and deeply held views, moral or ethical beliefs, just to be able to do a job? I think the protection needs to be there, but there also has to be some wiggle room from an employer side of like, hey man, this is part of the job description you signed up for. Now all of a sudden you for some reason you can't deliver food. It's like, it's a head scratcher for me. I'm just glad I'm not in HR, because it seems wildly, displaced on you applied for a job that you now find morally objective, like, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. But I think, if you're in HR, the bottom line is just talk to the employee, right? Figure out what's going on. Assume good intent. Don't necessarily assume bad intent. Assume that there really is a religiously held or deeply held belief. We could get into all the ways this is actually rearing its ugly head in society. And I think on our next podcast, we're going to be talking a little bit about culture wars, but there are some deeply held religious beliefs that are causing problems in the workplace. But, we are a society who accommodates others, and we try to, give people the benefit of the doubt for the most part. And the law does as well. So, come in with an open mind, talk to the employee, and hopefully the employee is willing to discuss why, the reasons behind this, and, work it out. So on that cheery note, I think this calls to a close another episode of the Profitless on Purpose podcast. We certainly appreciate you being here with us today. On behalf of AJ and myself, please join us. We'll be here again next week. Of course, you can reach out to us at Profitless Pod on Twitter, or just comment down below here if you're watching this on YouTube, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.